Father Andrew Dalton is a native of Atlanta, Georgia. He's a Catholic priest of the Legionaries of Christ and assistant professor of theology of the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum in Rome, Italy, where he teaches biblical theology of the Passion of Christ. In addition to his philosophy and theology degrees, he obtained his postgraduate certificate in Shroud Studies in collaboration with the International Center of Sindonology, Shroud Studies, in Turin, Italy. He has lectured all over the world on the Shroud of Turin and the physical sufferings of Jesus. He's done this in China, Singapore, and the Philippines. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to give a warm welcome to Father Andrew Dalton.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. It's a privilege to follow after my own master. And Barry Schwartz spoke this morning and gave a perfect introduction to Shroud Studies, and I'm glad I get to piggyback on that and hopefully carry the conversation forward as we consider now explicitly matters of faith, matters of theology. And so what a great case study we have before us today of the intersection between faith and reason. And we already got a little highlight of that even in Barry's own story at the end, and it's always very moving to me to see that testimony. It's not just about the convincing of one's mind, is it? But it's also about the moving of one's own heart. And I think it's so beautiful when each of us realize that God of the universe has reached down and tapped us on the shoulder and called us by name. And I hope to get into this intersection more as we move forward. But I want to highlight the big question that's on the table today, which is precisely this. What is the relationship between heaven and earth, between humanity and divinity, between the visible and the invisible, right? Faith and reason, how do they intersect? A lot of people assume, and you can ask this question of the young people I know in America, the number one reason that young people aren't followers of Jesus, they say, they're not Christians, because science. And isn't it interesting that we've substituted scientism for science? Scientism which a priori just rejects the possibility of faith, the possibility of miracles, the possibility of heaven somehow touching down here on earth. And the shroud brings this kind of question into the fore. What is the mechanism by which this body image on the shroud was formed? We don't know. It's one of the great mysteries. Naturalistic attempts to explain it have come up empty-handed so far, at least. How do you explain? I don't pretend to have the definitive answers to these questions, but I love the introduction that we've received so far. As we move forward now into my talk, which will be broken up into two parts, I want to show how we can look at the shroud with two different lenses. We can look with the eyes of a Christian, or we could look with the eyes of a scientist. We could be pilgrims, or we could be examiners. And we can be both, right? So let's do just that. I want to show how in John 20, verses 1 through 10, this is the great passage that Catholics throughout the world will read on Easter Sunday. And I know you're familiar with it, but we need to take a new look at it today. Because you probably haven't noticed, if you're anything like me anyway, how many times the word Othonia appears. This is the word that gets translated linen cloths or burial cloths. And why does the evangelist give it so much attention? I don't know if you've ever felt frustrated reading the scriptures when you want to know all those details about how many times was he scourged, how many thorns were there on the crown, Was he pierced between the 5th and 6th rib, or up a little higher? Was he 30 feet tall on the cross, or was he just 6 inches off the ground? Were there 2 men scourging him? Where were the nail wounds in the hand? There are 1,000 questions that the gospel leaves unanswered, isn't it? But when it comes to this moment, the moment of the discovery of the empty tomb and these linen cloths lying there, 3 verses and 3 mentions, back to back to back. And I don't know if you've ever scratched your head and asked, why? Why is it significant? Okay, so what I'm going to do right now is look with the eyes of a pilgrim at these verses to show you why Christians are interested in the shroud. It's just probably painfully obvious, but at the same time, worth reconsideration today. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. He saw and believed. That's verse 8. And this, we've got to stop and just see why this is a jaw-dropping moment. That's the first instance in all of the Christian scriptures that gives mention of distinctively Christian faith. Right? The core of Christianity claims that God took flesh, died for our sins, and rose for our justification. The first time they believed it, at least the first time they're taking baby steps towards that belief, is on this day. I want to take John the Evangelist by the lapels and shake him. What did you see so that you believed, right? What is it about dirty laundry right on the ground that forces him to conclude that Jesus is risen of the dead? Now, we don't know. We can't jump in a time machine and reconstruct that moment and imagine that we could see what he himself saw. But this is what the Catechism of the Catholic Church does say about these verses. It says that it was the condition of the empty tomb, something about the way it was and what he saw, that led them to believe that something very special had taken place. That Jesus, the absence of this body, was not just because of some resuscitation of a corpse. No, something definitively new had taken place. Now, what in the world could he have seen? I love, if you look to the scriptures, if you're looking to crack the code of the language that's there, it's hard to pick up in translation. But you know that even though in English it says, he saw, and he saw 3 times, they see the linen cloths. But actually in Greek, it's 3 different verbs. Okay? So first, who is it that sees at first, if not John, the one who runs faster because he's younger, right? He gets to the tomb first. He does not go in. He stands at the top of the stairwell that leads into an antechamber, and then you have 3 spaces for bodies on the left, on the right, and before you, in a typical first century tomb in Jerusalem. So why does he stoop low? Because now he gets a better angle inside. He can see deep within, and he sees those linen cloths on the ground. But he's at a distance, see? Blepo is the verb that's there. He sees, but he's not up close. It's Peter who he awaits, and Peter goes into the tomb. And now he gets up close to the cloth that wrapped the body of Jesus, and he saw. But guess what? It's not blepo anymore. It's a new verb. Theoreo. This is where we get the word theory, for example. Right? Now, where are we going with this? It'd be hard to know if you didn't have the third stage, because that's when John follows after Peter into the tomb, and he saw and believed. And this is a major motif in the Gospel of John, as you probably picked up on from other passages. Think of John chapter 9 and the man who's born blind. And he can't see, can he? Until the very end of that passage, when he says, I've seen the Lord. But it's not blepo anymore, nor is it theoreo. That was stage 2. Stage 3 is the verb horao, right? You might have heard the expression, eureka! Eureka comes from that verb, right? I have seen. There is a type of vision which is natural. There is a deeper type of vision, a crescendo in light, you might say. And that's the vision of faith. So we can see with natural eyes, but we don't just have these natural organs. We have spiritual faculties that we can see the unseen. We can see invisible realms by a gift of God. John saw more than Peter in that first moment. He saw and believed. That was the first baby steps towards a fullness of faith. And it happened when they saw these cloths. That's the fascinating detail that I didn't pay close enough attention to when I was just a little seminarian. Because, see, our faith is not blind. Sometimes you'll hear that expression. Have you heard that expression? Blind, with blind faith I follow. But actually, that's not exactly the best metaphor, is it? Because Jesus himself said, believe in me, or else believe because of the works that I do. Peter would say, be ready to share the reason for the hope that is in you. See, we have reasons to believe and to hope. Reasons. And John had a reason that day too. What did he see so that he believed? This is the question we all got to know. I wish we could jump in one of those like Michael J. Fox time machines and go back to the first century and check it out for ourselves. I don't know what you think. Tell me in the break what your reconstruction of the scene might be. Somebody said, I know what he saw. Jesus always folded his napkin in exactly the same way. And he folded up those linens, and that was like his signature. I'm back. Well, I'm not sure that from the text you can easily arrive at that conclusion. But I think that interpreter is actually on to something. He's noticing that he saw, and when he saw it, because he saw it, he began to believe. So what did he see? No one was there in the moment of resurrection. Right? Mary Magdalene gets up early, but not early enough. He's gone. The tomb is empty. Who was there? No one, except the cloth. Do you know that the Shroud of Turin has sometimes been called the silent witness? It was there in the very moment the cadaver turned into the risen, glorified, divinized body of Jesus. Could it be that nowadays we can dial up the volume on the testimony of that witness? The Shroud has been called the fifth gospel. What the four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tell us about the sufferings of the Savior, well now, Shroud Science records. I think we are privileged to be able to study this in this day and age because it tells us such great insights about the sufferings of this man. But we have to make the case, of course, that the man of the shroud is the historical person, Jesus of Nazareth. Now, thankfully, Barry Schwartz has already gone a long way, and so I can simply add some details to what he already explained. But I want to do this experiment as a case study with each of you today. Look with the eyes of a scientist in a first moment and ask, what does the shroud record? What did he suffer? Then, in a second moment, pick up your Bible and ask the question, why? What does it mean? And not just generally, but I want to say, what does this particular detail about Christ's sufferings reveal? This is an exercise that is not so easy. If you're like me and you pray your Stations of the Cross during the season of Lent, you sometimes might just get to that point where you're before the image of Christ's cross and you're just thinking, boy, that really hurt. And this is like the sum of your spiritual life, isn't it? It's like, ouch. But we got to go deeper than that, right? And ask the question, what does it mean? So sometimes we're going to put down the microscope and we're going to pick up the scriptures. And we're going to look with the eyes of a pilgrim. But I want you, and each of you is free to judge to what extent these two visions are compatible. Can you be a pilgrim and a scientist at the same time? Or are these completely incompatible realms, as many moderns assume? So that's for each one to judge. Of course, it's very popular today to consider the shroud a medieval fake. I was giving this talk recently, and somebody said, Father, after you gave me all that information, I was just looking at that image of those men. And the 1260 to 1390 with the exclamation mark, and the posture as they're standing before this monumental, these columns, and I didn't need to hear a whole lot more. I could tell the posture that was behind that. I thought that was interesting. I can say that now without prefacing it, just because Barry has already shed some light on the carbon dating. We'll speak even more about it in the afternoon. But obviously, if the shroud dates to the Middle Ages, it doesn't belong to the historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, and so therefore can't really tell us very much about his physical sufferings. Okay? Now, it should also be clear that if we could prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the shroud is medieval, that the Christian faith wouldn't crumble. In fact, there is no such dogma. It's not in the catechism. It's not required for anyone anywhere to believe that the Shroud of Turin is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus, right? I mean, it could be proven false tomorrow, and it wouldn't matter for us as Christians. Now, I think it's pretty nice and it's pretty interesting that it's there, and you do need to treat it responsibly, historically, and try to accommodate it and account for it. But at the same time, there's no risk really involved for us as Christians. So this is simply a great case study to pick up your microscopes and to pick up your Bibles to see to what extent this is believable, okay? So, know that the reason scientists are interested in the shroud, this is really modern. It really goes back to the moment that Barry was speaking about earlier, when Secondo Pia noticed the photographic-like qualities of the shroud. Sometimes the shroud is called a photo document in the sense that it acts in a similar fashion, not exactly as a photograph, but in a similar fashion in that the photo negative that Secondo Pia develops is actually revelatory of the positive image. So I think this was already explained well, but I just want to say, can you imagine, can you imagine in 1840, this is the new technology of the day. In 1840, the first dactylographs are invented. Here we are some 60 years later, and what do you do if you're at a wedding at the royal family, and to add a little pomp and circumstance to the moment, what do? You whip out the burial shroud of Jesus. That's what you do. And this was going to be the occasion that allowed for this linen, which had been venerated for long centuries, to be exposed to new scientific equipment, right? We don't think of this technology in that way now, but it really was mesmerizing. To read his account, he tells how he was trembling, developing the image to say, am I holding an image of the face of God? You know, this is just to zoom in on that face. You can probably make it out from where you are, the different qualities of the eyes and the nose, but imagine if you were an artist and you'd never seen the photo negative of this. Now you paint a picture of it. I just want you to notice for a moment, look how it would be very tempting to discern the outlines of the eyes as the sockets themselves. See that? You would paint bulging eyes. You might be tempted to paint in your icon a linen across the bottom of the chin. Barry explained how that was a crease in the linen. Or maybe you would look at this blood flow from the frontal vein that looks like the shape of an epsilon. Right? Maybe that's a hair soaked in blood. Maybe the cheeks are disproportionate, such that the right cheek is more swollen than the left. Maybe there's a triangle between the eyebrows. Right? These things would be very tempting if you're following the shroud as a prototype. Well, don't you know that we have dozens of icons down through the centuries, some of them as old as the 6th century, some in the 12th. You could compare and contrast 13 or 15 qualities, all of them very counterintuitive from an artistic point of view, and yet they follow the shroud. And so many have noticed that the shroud was called the Hematopoiesis, the not made with human hands. The image that was of divine authority, and so it couldn't be meddled with. We couldn't just take artistic license and present new images because we're following this. Now, Secondo Pia develops that image and sees the photo negative, which is a positive. To state it in oversimplified terms. But look now at just how intelligible this image is. Look at, for example, the separation between the lips, the contours around the eyes and eyelashes, the separation of the beard, as some have posited, right? These are things that would be very difficult to discern on the linen itself, especially because over time, the white linen becomes more yellow, and therefore the contrast with the body image is less and less as time progresses. Okay? So, what a marvelous day for Secondo Pio when he discovered this. Now, you might think, gosh, what a great discovery. There's probably a monument to Secondo Pia in Turin, right? Hardly. Hardly. They say, come on, Secondo Pio, where did you get this image? This is too good to be true. And I want to point this out because it's not so different what we live in our own day and age. Jesus is always and everywhere a sign of contradiction. Secondo Pia is not believed. It's not until 1931 when Giuseppe Enria repeats the experiment on orthochromatic film, on the whole length of the shroud, that we discover this image. It works for the whole shroud. There's this effect of inverting the grayscale such that we return at the positive image by looking at the negative. Now, since this was already mentioned, why do I repeat it again? Because I want to take this reflection a step further and look now that we've looked with the photograph, to look a bit with the eyes of a pilgrim. Why would it be appropriate that God give us an image in this way? Now, I can't give you the definitive answer to this question. It's really more for your own consideration. But isn't it interesting that when the grayscale is inverted, you get a clearer image? Let me give you a counterexample. Good Friday doesn't sound so good, right? If it's the day that we put God to death. It's the day, we didn't just perpetrate homicide against Jesus, but deicide, right? Because we killed God. What is good then about Good Friday? Look at what Pope Benedict will say about this fact. The fact that the shroud acts as a photo document. I thought this was fascinating. The death of the Son of God, Jesus of Nazareth, has an opposite aspect, totally positive. So it's not just negative, says the Holy Father. There's something positive about this death of Jesus. It's a source of comfort and of hope. And this reminds me of the fact that the Holy Shroud acts as a photographic document, with both a positive and a negative. And in fact, this is really how it is. The darkest mystery of faith is at the same time the most luminous sign of a never-ending hope. I thought that was so fascinating. He's saying, he's looking at the shroud, he's noticing the inversion of the grayscale, and he's saying, yeah, that is how it is. It reminds me of St. Paul, where sin abounded, grace abounds all the more. That God draws good out of every instance of evil. So isn't it appropriate, this image that contains the crucified Savior, I believe, should be presented to us in an inverted fashion? I think there's a spiritual reflection there that we can carry into our own devotion. All right. As we move forward, I want to also just consider this face. There's some here that I think promoted the devotion of the Holy Face. You might know that some who have entered religious orders, like Sainte Thérèse de Lisieux, changed her name to Saint Child. Her name is Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, but when she entered religion, she was of the Child Jesus and the Holy Face. So it's a long name, right? To call her for dinner. I don't know if you say that all the way. But there's something deep here. There's something very deep that our vocation as Christians is to come face to face with God. This is a very unique perspective of Judeo-Christianity, actually, where we don't see God as infinitely far away. Yes, he's transcendent, but not distant, not a stranger. He's not a master over slaves merely. He's a father over sons and daughters. And our greatest beatitude, says St. Paul, is to see him face to face. I always thought, gosh, are we like second-rate Christians because we weren't born in the first century? You know, Peter, James, and John, they got to look on the visible, incarnate God. Could it be that he didn't just privilege one generation, but he actually left a trace of his material existence down through the centuries? Does that seem likely to you? This is what a certain Yves Delage would write. He's an agnostic, by the way. This is right at the turn of the century, 1900, 1903. He writes a paper noticing that this body is anatomically flawless. He writes a paper, the conclusion of which is the man of the shroud is Jesus of Nazareth. He's just noting that the pathologies that he suffered correspond to the historical data of how Jesus was crucified, nail wounds in the hands and feet. There would be scourging and then a carrying of the cross, of course, a pierced side, a crown of thorns. A number of elements converge on Jesus. I mean, just so you can get a sense of the probabilities here, if you were to make a list of all of those men who were crucified and crowned, just take two elements, crucifixion and crowning. How many people make that list? How many historical people were both crowned and crucified? One. If there were others, it wasn't written down. What's the probability then that this is not Jesus if there's this accumulation of sufferings that pile up one on top of another? Okay, so Yves Delage is ostracized from the community of science. They don't publish his paper in the Académie des Sciences. And so he writes to his friend, I don't understand why people are so scandalized that I'm saying there's a material trace of Jesus' existence. If I were writing about Xerxes or Pharaoh, no one would have anything to say. And this is the same today. I think you'll see this bias is often there. Okay, so this opens the door to Shroud Studies. Secondo Pia's discovery says it's not just the Christians who are interested in, contemplating the linen that contains perhaps the face of God, or that is soaked into its very fibers, the blood that was shed for our salvation. Now that they're noticing these photographic qualities on the shroud, scientists like these two from the United States Air Force Academy notice the three-dimensional qualities that are also able to be deciphered, extracted with the help of the VPA image analyzer. And now you have an absolute unicum. Can you imagine any other linen claws that act as a photo document? There are none. How many do you think contain three-dimensional information on a two-dimensional cloth? There are none. The shroud stands in a class on its own. Just from a scientific perspective, it's got to be explained how the image was formed. And even though we've dedicated hundreds of thousands of hours of study to the shroud, before, during, and after the Shroud of Turin research project, by the way, we still don't know the answer to this question. And so, how do we make sense of it? This is where each one needs to answer for his or herself. What I think is fascinating about this VP8 image analyzing result is that, I think this is exemplified here. Can you see the distance to the cloth here at the Adam's apple is obviously more than the distance here at the nose. When they notice that there's this ratio of between the distance between the cadaver and the cloth and the intensity of coloration, I'm not sure if this was clear, but the cloth is monochromatic. It's all one hue. But there's a higher concentration of color, namely where it's more in contact with the cloth. So wherever something sticks out, like the nose or the hands, that's where you're going to get more coloration. This is completely different from every other artist's piece of work. One of the reasons that we know that it wasn't a painting. I want to really drive home this fact because it gets repeated so often. The one thing that the shroud cannot be is a painting. Why? Because there's no paint, there's no organic or inorganic pigment, there is no varnish, there is no dye, there is no directionality, no brush strokes with which coloration is applied. This color is on the very surface of the fibrils. And notice I didn't say fibers. A fiber is constituted by thousands probably of little fibrils, microfibrils. That it's just the outer rim of these fibers that are colorized. To give you a more specific explanation of the colorization there, we're talking 200 to 500 nanometers is the depth of penetration of coloration of the shroud. That's a figure that doesn't even mean much to me. I prefer to think of a human hair that you divide in 20 equal parts. 1/20th the width of a human hair. That's the depth of penetration of the color on the surface of the shroud. We don't have a micro laser today in 2019 that's able to deliver a micro burn that precise. And so whenever this is repeated, particularly around Easter, by the way, that the shroud is a medieval fake, you've really got to question your source. Because we're nowhere close. We're nowhere close to that. All right, move forward. The Shroud of Turin research project was already explained in great depth, but I want to now consider what they know from the different batteries of, I don't know if Barry gave a full list of all of the different tests, but we're talking physics and chemistry and biology and forensic medicine, blood sample analysis, sticky tape samples, X-ray, infrared, ultraviolet, pyrolysis mass spectroscopy. It goes on and on. So we have, I think it's over 20 peer-reviewed articles that come out as a direct result of STIRP. 78, they do the test within 2-3 years. All of those articles are out, and you can read them on shroud.com. All of them are pointing in the direction of authenticity. Nothing really goes against authenticity. That is, and when I say authentic there, I mean a cloth from the 1st century that would pertain to the historical person Jesus of Nazareth. The one good argument, or the one, let's say, substantial argument, is that of radiocarbon dating. That would go against it. But it's just one in a sea of so many. But it's not. This is something that I have to communicate a lot in the Postgraduate Certificate of Shroud Studies that we offer in Rome. It's not just the question of authenticity that should capture our focus. Right? It probably has capitalized most of the literature. It's monopolized the literature there, I mean, because the question is so urgent from the perspective of the scientists. They want to know if it could possibly belong to Jesus or not. But the deeper question will always be not what, but why. And this is really where I call upon each of you to kind of do your homework, to ask not just what of these sufferings, but why he suffered them. Do you remember that Jesus said, no one takes my life from me, he says. I lay it down of my own accord. I've got the power to lay it down and the power to take it up again. This is the charge I've received from my Father. So apparently, according to Jesus' own words, he's not the victim of circumstances beyond his control here. He's actually stepping into these sufferings. And that suggests an intentionality that we've really got to wrap our minds around. And the microscope isn't going to help much in answering that question. That's why we need the scriptures. That's my job today. All right. So, Shroud Basics, we already saw the dimensions. But I want to simply add a detail now as we consider the scriptures. I want to ask you the question of, okay, it's 2 by 8 as far as Syrian cubits. It's a massive cloth. But what's the import of that? What's the relevance of that discovery? The relevance is this. Who is purchasing this? Why do we have a contradiction glaring us in the face here? In his death, Jesus was treated as a criminal. He's tortured, he's scourged, he's crowned with thorns, he's pierced in the side. Hardly someone you would expect to be buried as a king. This is the contradiction that you can't make sense of, I think, without the biblical data. Who offers his own rock-hewn tomb to bury Jesus? I heard it over here. Joseph of Arimathea, who's a member of the Sanhedrin, a man of high social standing. Somebody purchases 100 pounds of aloe, Roman pounds, that's 75 of our pounds. Who is that? Nicodemus. Very nice. Nicodemus, also a member of the Sanhedrin. Does Jesus have friends in high places who could provide for this kind of thing in his burial? Yeah, read the biblical account. They're exactly the ones taking care of his burial. Does Jesus have men in high places who want him on the cross? Pontius Pilate could administer capital punishment. The man of the shroud shows sufferings of these kinds. Okay, so that's actually really important. It's often overlooked as we settle on the minutiae, asking questions about, and I like that stuff too. Is this pollen grain from the 1st century? Is this a coin that's over the eye? I'm not convinced that it is. So many other questions like that. But the macro questions are often more important. All right. We've already explained how the shroud has a double image, a double body image, the front and the back. I'll signal it here. I just want to draw your attention once again to the fact that it's only one side of the image that is colorized with the body image. If you look to the back of the cloth here, there's no image on the cloth. There's no body image visible from the back side. Paolo Di Lazzaro is a physicist and friend of mine. He also teaches with Barry and myself at the Regina Apostolorum, the Pontifical University. He has spent 5 years studying ultraviolet light. He was trying to colorize linen fibers simply by exposing them to some sort of radiation. So you can play with the duration of exposure, the amplitude, the frequency. He settles on UV, and after 5 years comes to the determination that you need something like 34,000 billion watts behind a laser that we've not yet invented in order to get this kind of effect. I'll let you read his paper for the details, but do you think there is a socket somewhere in this room that offers that kind of wattage? The greater mystery is even if there is that kind of energy unleashed on this cloth, it was in a fraction of a second. Because if not, you would have incinerated the cloth and probably left a crater the size of Hiroshima in Jerusalem, which is evidently not there. And so, just to highlight the fact that we are so far away from reproducing this artificially in a laboratory, that it's really, to my mind, dishonest when a tabloid-type researchers say, I, with technology easily available in the 1300s, can reproduce the image on the shroud. That's just not true. All right. What could be responsible for this? I don't think we mentioned earlier that under the blood stains, if you looked, for example, here at the side where the lance pierced to the heart, there's a blood stain there. What if we were to look underneath that blood? Would we see an imaged cloth? You might think so, right? Especially if this were a painting. I mean, if I were to ask you, which would you do? Would you paint the blood stains first, and then in a second moment paint the body? Or would you paint the body and then, depending on where the hands were, add the blood stains on top? I think most of us would do the latter, not the former. And yet the shroud is the exact opposite. Underneath the shroud, underneath the blood stains, in the strip removed a piece of some of the blood that was on the surface of the fibers, and then the fibers were not colorized. So here's the image that I give for this. Sunscreen. Right? You never know when you miss that spot and you put on the sunscreen, and that's where you get scorched, right in the middle of the back, right? It's as if the blood is acting as sunscreen. It's acting as a positive lens. It's protecting the fibers. But whatever it is that caused the body image happened in a second moment, once the blood was already there. And the blood has a surface layer of protection so that this radiant energy, if that's the best way to describe it, didn't touch those fibers. So this is why you have to ask the question that I asked at the start. Are we looking to merely naturalistic causes for the image on the shroud? Or should we be looking for another type of cause? Now, this is the intersection between faith and reason. This is what scientists can't do in a scientific way, right? A scientist cannot say a kind of cause that isn't naturalistic, right? He has to limit himself to simply natural cause, things we can measure, things that are empirical. All right, the herringbone weave is something that any scientist could notice. But what I want to ask is, what is its significance for faith? Not much, except that it tells that this cloth was extremely pricey. It's comparable to like a liturgical garment of a priest. And so it highlights this contradiction once again between the fact that Jesus seems to be a social outcast in as much as he's stripped naked and scourged and publicly humiliated, and yet then robed in majesty in his burial. And again, it's the biblical data that makes sense of that. There's the weave. Okay? Now, as we move forward, I want to step into the physical sufferings. And this is perhaps what was most interesting to me when I discovered this as a seminarian. Because even after 10 years of following Christ in the seminary and getting ready for the priesthood, I still didn't know anything about Shroud Studies. And I could not believe that it had so much to say about what the man suffered. And this will really help your devotion to the cross of Christ. And I think you enter into Lent a lot more. Now, I need to preface this a little bit, with what I'm about to say is going to be a little intense here. But it's not because I have some morbid curiosity about pain and suffering. It's just that, if I could quote Pope Benedict one more time, he says, speaking of the Passion of Christ, he says, "This is love in its most radical form." And to be fair, Jesus himself said that, didn't he? There is no greater love than to lay down your life for your friends. And this is where Jesus lays it down, but in the most extraordinary and painful and excruciating ways. And you've really got to ask, why? Why this? But you could have saved me with a paper cut, I suppose, right? Why not call that salvation? Why this? This is love in its most radical form. There's another reason we need the cross in our spiritual lives. I'll take a quote from St. John Paul II, who says, "There is no holiness without devotion to the Passion." Do you get that? You can't be holy without being centered on the Paschal mystery. which is only like the end of all of our life. We're all striving for holiness, but we can't get there without the cross. This is divine love made manifest in the most radical way. And so I offer that as a preamble to really invite you to go deeper than I'm going to be able to go in the next few minutes. But we often skip over Thursday night. Thursday night is where it all begins. First, Jesus takes the cup and he takes the bread. He says over the bread, "This is my body which is given for you." Of course, this is the cup of my blood which is shed for the forgiveness of sins. And so Jesus already gives the interpretive key, doesn't he, to the disciples to say, they're not taking my life, despite what it might seem. I'm laying it down. This is an offering. This is a holocaust, a sin offering. It's offered for the forgiveness of sins. Something the Roman centurions could not have seen. But then Jesus, after the third cup, they sing a hymn, they go off to the Garden of Gethsemane. Do you remember how Jesus is praying, "Let this cup pass from me"? I think we've read it so many times, we've pondered it too little, though, haven't we? Why is Jesus, the Son of God, begging the Father, "Let this pass"? And as he's praying it, what's happening in his body? Does anybody remember this detail? Yes. Who says that? Luke. Luke says, being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling on the ground. Do you know what Luke's job was? Ask Paul. He tells us that he was a physician. He's an iatros. He's a doctor. Could it be that what he's recording here is what moderns call hematopoiesis? You can find some peer-reviewed articles on this rare phenomenon, but what happens is your subcutaneous capillaries can become distended and burst, not because someone's scourging you, no one's punching you in the face, but just a moral suffering, and a fear of death that is imminent. It's so powerful that your blood vessels explode. So you're not sweating blood, to be fair. You're sweating sweat. But the hemorrhaged blood is mixing with it is exiting out of the adjacent sweat pores, and that's what bubbles to the surface, a kind of red substance that makes little dots all over the surface of skin. Men who are in concentration camps, who are in a shipwreck and fearing death, or babies when they saw a syringe or a long needle, can have this effect. In some articles, I've read that it leaves the surface of the skin sensitive to touch. So even just to blow air over the surface of the skin would be painful. Why I think that's so significant is that even though we can't know from looking at the shroud if the man suffered hematopoiesis, but if what Luke describes is this rare phenomenon, it's likely, it seems, that Jesus suffered not just the hematopoiesis, but all those blows and all that violence that came after is intensified because of this first suffering. And so a question I like to ask the kids that visit our exhibition is, who remembers the first violence that was done to Jesus when he was arrested? The first physical force that was inflicted upon him after the hematopoiesis. Does anyone care to? A slap? That's already with the Sanhedrin, but how does he get to the Sanhedrin? They have to arrest him, right? And how are they going to know which one to arrest? These soldiers are not followers, they're not disciples. You're on to me. Do you know it took me like a year and a half of giving tours to think of this aspect? It never dawned on me that the kiss of Judas would register in his body as physical pain. And yet, how poignant. If a kiss ought to be a sign of friendship, of love, of loyalty. Judas turns that exactly upside down when he approaches Jesus with a nonchalance that is just chilling, right? Because what he's really saying with that kiss is, I hope you die, right? And then that sign is completely betrayed. And it's appropriate then that it registered in the body of the Savior as physical pain. Now, what you see from a scientific glance at this face is that, yes, they struck him. The American scientists noticed that it's a club, usually I hear the dimensions of 1.5 inches in diameter. So it's not just the face. Yes, we get that verb of slapping in the Gospels, but it also says they struck, and that word can mean strike with a club. Now, if we have both verbs appearing side by side, it's likely that they both don't mean the same exact thing. The Americans also noticed that the nose is broken. So come 2/3 down the nose and you'll see that the septum is separated. There's an excoriation that moves from the left cheek to the right. There's a special swollenness on the right cheek, which is also significant because swelling doesn't set in right away. If you punch me now, I'll swell tomorrow. Now that also accords with the gospel account because he's punched on Thursday night, he's laid to rest on Friday evening. Was there time for swelling to set in? Oh yeah. And that's exactly what the shroud records. Okay? What the shroud doesn't record and cannot record is why they struck him. Okay, so this is where we need to do our homework as Christians and turn back to the biblical page and ask, what gets Jesus into such trouble? He's before the Sanhedrin, but he's not saying anything. And so he's slipping through their fingertips, and Caiaphas, the high priest, knows it, because even though he's brought in false testimony to say, oh, he'll rebuild the temple in 2 days, or was it 3? They're not even agreeing amongst themselves. It's a botched job. It's embarrassing. And so the high priest stands up at one point and takes matters into his own hands. And this is powerful. He is the highest religious authority in the land as high priest. And he uses, the gospel writer uses very technical language here. He says, I exorcizo you, I adjure you. That is, I put you under solemn oath. Think of that. And what's the killer question? Jesus, mind you, has answered none of the questions to this point. He's like a lamb led to the slaughter. He opens not his mouth, to quote Isaiah 53. What's the question that gets Jesus a death sentence? What's that? Jealousy? Yeah, that's the motive. But in order to incriminate him, they need a crime. What's his crime? Are you... I'm hearing mixed things. It's hard for me on this, sorry, but exactly. Sometimes you'll get the question, are you the king of the Jews? But that's actually Friday that question comes from Pontius Pilate, who's a pagan, not a Jew, so he can ask, are you the king of those guys, the Jews? But on Thursday night, it's, are you the Messiah? Huh? Are you the Christos? Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? This is so powerful because Jesus should have stayed silent, right? If I were his lawyer, I'd say, Jesus, you just plead the fifth every single time, okay? Because they need to prove your guilt. Meanwhile, it's 2/3 of the Sanhedrin, a fraction of the full body. This is an illegitimate reunion in the first place. But they're itching for a reason to put Jesus to death. And Jesus serves it right up on a silver platter. You've got to take note of this, right, as a historian. Jesus answers this question by saying, are you the Son of God? Are you the Messiah? Ego eimi, he says, right, in the Greek. I am. Echoes of Exodus 3:14, right? When God said to Moses, I am. And then he goes on to quote 2 key messianic passages from the Old Testament. Daniel 7:13 and 14, and then Psalm 110. I am, and you shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power. Whoa, bad timing, Jesus, right? The high priest rends his garments and says, you've heard the blasphemy from his own lips. What do you think? Worthy of death. And so they cart him off to the man who can deliver, Pontius Pilate. So think of this. The reason that Jesus was brought to the cross wasn't because he wasn't a political insurrectionist. It wasn't because he was going to rebuild the temple in X number of days. It was because of the confession of who he said that he was. One with the Father? Blasphemy. Right? So, indeed, these are the most shocking claims anyone could make. And we would have to discard them ourselves, except for one thing. He died and rose from the dead. And all of a sudden, he who has ears, let him hear, right? Because I don't know anybody else who could do something similar. Now, we're out of time for now, but when we come back, what we need to take up is the question of death and resurrection. Do we have evidence not just that he suffered, but that this man was also God, such that he can do what only God can do? Is the cause of the shroud, the body image there, is it the natural effect of a supernatural event? Or is it the natural effect of a mere natural event? This is the biggie. That's the big question. It's not easy to answer. And to be honest, no one can force the answer upon anyone else. I can't point to Barry, for example, and say, "You're so silly, you're so foolish. Don't you know there's proof that Jesus rose from the dead?" I don't have proof that Jesus rose from the dead. I want to be crystal clear about that. Our belief in the resurrection is just that, belief. It's a dogma of faith that we give intellectual assent to because the one who revealed it has credibility, has a divine authority about it. But I can't prove that empirically. But nor can the naturalist point a finger at me and say, "It's so unreasonable that you believe." Because everything that we hold by faith is reasonable. So this is to quote St. Thomas Aquinas, that in turn is quoted by the Catechism. This is the big question. What is the cause of the shroud? A natural event or a supernatural event? What is the relationship between heaven and earth, between divinity and humanity, between nature and supernature, between nature and grace? This is the tough question. I believe it's the Catholic worldview that gives the most coherent answer to that question, but I'll have to come back with that in the end, and I'll close with a song in the afternoon. I hope you'll be there after lunch. Thank you for your attention.